It is my pleasure to turn the chair position over to Ralph Moore, who will facilitate the conversation with two fascinating and extraordinary people. Three, including yourself.
Oh, okay, well, if you must. We've got 2 minutes of video that Brendan's going to introduce. It's going to take a second minute. Just 2 minutes.
What you're going to see on the video is 2 minutes of the beginning of the film Hit and Stay.
Hello?
That has been shown at the Maryland Film Festival, and then also will be shown at various times in May, because this is the 50th anniversary of the burning of draft files in Catonsville, Maryland, by 9 people, called the Catonsville 9. So what you'll see is the beginning of the film, and there's a TV reporter, Pat McGrath, who was notified that there was going to be an important anti-war demonstration. That's all he knew. And the draft files were kept on the 2nd floor of the Knights of Columbus building, right on Frederick Avenue, across from the library. So there's going to be a dedication on Saturday of a historic marker noting that draft files were burned at the Knights of Columbus building. I have to say that the Knights of Columbus take no responsibility, nor do they want a sign on their property. This is the beginning of church and state in bed with one another. And so you're going to see Pat McGrath kind of explaining, and then you'll see a very short clip of them actually burning 300 and some odd records, and those records were burned with homemade napalm that was made the night before. If you wanted to make some yourself, a little gasoline and ivory flakes will do the job. Napalm was used because it's very, very insidious. When it burns the skin, and you can't put it out. And this is what we did to the children, the men and women in Vietnam, and we lost over 58,000 U.S. soldiers and untold millions of Vietnamese. And so I've noticed that none of the panelists so far have talked about the war, and the war is the thing. And so we'll have that clip.
Well, you know, what I talk about first is how I came to be here, you know, and about the fact that they didn't tell us anything. They didn't tell us what it was other than the source that I had said this was going to be a big story. So we knew that we were going to be covering some kind of a demonstration. We didn't know what it was, what the nature of it was, etc., and had no idea what we were doing out here. But you know, at this point, it wasn't. There were no the signs. There were no big signs screaming draft. Well, we didn't know what we had, and again, there was a sense that whatever was happening was already underway, and that we better go quickly or we're going to miss it. We ran around, somewhat out of breath, around the side of the building, and that's when the cameraman, Bob Boyer, turned on his camera, and you see the shaky footage, and you see, I believe it was John Hogan, who actually lit the match and started the fire. When we first got there, we had no idea what we were looking at. You know, the first thing obviously you spotted immediately was there were 2 Catholic priests there. Of course, I recognized Phil Bergen immediately because he was a figure of some importance in the news in Baltimore at the time, and I recognized his brother Dan.
At the height of the Vietnam War, 9 Catholics entered this white frame building in Catonsville, Maryland. It was a draft order. The 9, some of them Catholic priests,
Excuse me.
There's about 2 hours more, but we won't show it.
Please check it out. It's called Hit and Stay. I highly recommend it. Good afternoon. My name is Ralph Moore. Am I supposed to be standing up? Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm going to introduce you to these 2 fine friends of mine. But let me take a moment of personal privilege and talk for a second about my association with the peace movement / anti-war movement. They're one and the same. I was influenced by the 3 M's: Martin, Muhammad, and Motown. And I'll explain that in a second. But today I'm wearing my Peace Camp T-shirt. I've still been a bit of a hippie in terms of trying to bring peace and justice and to teach the peace to the children. We have to teach it to them, especially when everything else is telling them to war and fight and all of that. And I'm also wearing a button that Brendan and Willa gave me, and this button was made from a nuclear weapon, right?
Not nuclear, just a regular weapon.
That's a what?
Not a nuclear weapon, just a regular weapon.
A regular weapon? Oh, I thought it was a nuclear weapon. I was really gassed about that. Jeez. How did they do that? Right. I was glowing about that. Nonetheless, but this button was made from a weapon. It suggests that we do what the prophet Isaiah urged us to do, which was to turn swords into plowshares and pruning hooks and spears into pruning hooks. I wanted to follow a bit of a timeline, but before I do, I want to introduce a guest who was originally invited, and she can't be here today. That's Liz McAllister. Liz McAllister was the wife of Philip Berrigan, and she wanted to come, but she happens to be in jail now, right? She just turned 78 years old. She did a demonstration on April 4th of this year, just a few weeks ago, on the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. It was at Kings Bay in Georgia, which is the largest nuclear
Trident missiles.
Site in the world. She and, was it 6 others? 5 others.
5 others.
Went onto the site with bottles of blood and hammers, I believe,
Right.
and it was in keeping with the types of actions that had been taking place against the war in Vietnam. Our focus today will be the Catonsville 9 action in 1968. Before we go there, though, and that would be in May 17th of 1968, before we go there, we need to trace and see the role of the church, the Catholic Church, in terms of the anti-war movement. The Catholic Church, I think, began to be spurred on by the teachings of Pope John the 23rd. Pope John the 23rd was elected in 1958, was Pope for 5 years, and died in 1963. But in the time he was there, he was very much a person who shook up the established order. He established, and Catholics derive from that the church is the people. But he said we need to bring some light, open up this church and bring some light into this church. And the whole social gospel movement was derived from his efforts. So Pope John was a big influence. And as we go through our timeline, a very big statement by a churchman was when Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1967, declared that he was opposed to the war in Vietnam. And he gave very good and strong and terrific reasons. I think that's the best speech he ever made. If you get a chance to read it, you should check it out. So that was April 4th, 1967. And April 28th, 1967, Muhammad Ali refused induction into the military. He had nothing to fight with the Viet Cong, he said. No Vietnam ever called me the N-word, he said, right? They're not my opposers, he said. So that's in 1967. At the end of 67, am I blocking you people? Don't be nice.
No.
You good folks. At the end of 67, the Baltimore 4 went into the custom house downtown and poured blood on the draft records down there. That included Phil Berrigan, Dave Everhart, Tom Lewis, and Reverend Swindle. Wendell?
Jim Mingle.
Jim Mingle.
Mingle, Jim Mingle. So those four did that action. And that caused quite a stir. And then on May 7th of 1968, May 17th, which happened to be the anniversary of the Brown decision. You know, the Brown decision from the Supreme Court was announced on May 17th, 1954. And I wouldn't be surprised if they picked May 17th, because I thought the group always did a lot of symbolism, made a lot of connections. But on that date, they, did their action that we're going to talk about in a few. Now let me just mention in terms of the Pope, incidentally, that Pope John the 23rd did 8 encyclicals or letters in his 5 years. And his last one, which he released to everybody, prior to that, he was essentially writing just to Catholics, but he said, this one is for everybody. And it was called Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. And it was about non-nuclear proliferation and all. And again, I think that was an influence on people's thinking, and it was a call to action to do something. Viktor Frankl once said that an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. And some might think that the draft board actions were abnormal reactions, but you have to understand them in a context and all. Anyway, I got inspired by the anti-war movement from King's statement, from what Martin Luther King did, and then the soundtrack of the movement in those days for me was Motown. You know, I don't know if you all remember, Edwin Starr did that song, War, what is it good for? Say it again. War, what is it good for?
Absolutely nothing.
Right, right. And then, there was that song. Frida Payne sang a song, Bring Them Back Home, Bring the Boys Home. You remember that? And Marvin Gaye did his What's Going On in 1971. War is not the answer, he sang. And I don't know if you remember, but during the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, there were lots of banners out in front of a lot of churches that said, war is not the answer, right? Well, I think it was a reference to Marvin Gaye's song. Marvin Gaye's song, incidentally, was written by a guy, along with Marvin Gaye, but who witnessed an act of police brutality out at Berkeley, California, at an anti-war rally. It's all kind of connected, I think, and we're trying to see those connections. Anyway, so again, I think the Pope was a big influencer. In 1968, early 1968, these two great people came to Baltimore. Willa was originally from Chicago, and Brendan was from New York. Brendan was in the seminary, and Willa was in the convent. And they came and they started Viva House, and they're going to tell us all about that in a moment or two. Now, I have to tell you that Brendan and I were co-workers at St. Ambrose Housing Aid Center, and we used to cause some mischief then, right? We did pickets, demonstrations, all that kind of thing, to raise the issue of housing for the poor and all. And it was great. It was fun working together. I think what I want to do is let them begin to tell some of their story. Why did you start Viva House? I thought I read somewhere that you all served about 1 million people over the first 45 years, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us why.
Well,
Oh,
because the need in Baltimore, I think everybody knows, is fantastic. And it wasn't as fantastic in '68, but the number of people that gradually were on the street and living in abandoned buildings grew exponentially. In 1950, Baltimore had a population of almost 1 million. Now it's a population of about 611,000. In our zip code, 21223, 40,000 people have left since we started Viva House in '68. So that's a half a century. And the poverty has increased along with it. We have unemployment over 50%. We have in one section, the section closest to Viva House, they call it Booth Boyd, has the lowest mortality rate in the state of Maryland. It's 10 years less than, say, Roland Park in the city. So the need in the city is great. But it's directly related, and I couldn't believe Senator Van Hollen didn't mention where all the damn money goes. The money goes right down the pot to the Pentagon. We spend more on money, 8 times more on money for the military than the next 8 countries combined. This country is more than safe, but it's not safe in the inner cities because the only job you can get is selling drugs. It's a terrible thing to admit, but that's the economy in our neighborhood. If there were no drugs, there would be no rents paid. There would be no food purchased. That's the sad part of the thing. So the Catholic worker, which means Catholic in the sense of universal, has what they call a program. Here's the program. It's very much like Erica was talking about, very common sense. To do the works of mercy, feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, visit the imprisoned. You do those things, but you also have to resist the works of war. You have to resist the works of war. We got a madman at the wheel, and each day more clowns get out of the car. But it's a sad state. And he talks about nuclear weapons as if nobody's going to get hurt. Everybody gets hurt with nuclear weapons. That's really important. So the philosophy of Viva House over the years has been simply to do the works of mercy and resist the works of war. Most people like to hear you say how many people came in today. And yeah, we've had over 1 million people sit down at the table for meals. We've probably provided shelter for at least 1,500 women and children. But that's not the main work. The main work is to keep some kind of hope alive, and joy is the thing that keeps it going. Joy is part of love, as Erica said. And so that's what we've been doing. It's really, really simple. You don't have to, if you want to start a Catholic worker house, you just start it. And we of course, knew Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. And one of the things they used to say was, the world would be better off if people tried to become better and not better off. And that seems to be the way the country's going. You know, the other thing Senator Van Hollen didn't mention, that 8 guys in the world have as much wealth as half the world. Think about that when you think about the 1%, and this guy ain't even showing his tax returns. Give me a break, huh? You know, give me a break. Anyway, that's a little bit, you can ask questions and stuff, but now Will is even better.
Go ahead.
Questions about
I would like that.
about the Catonsville 9 action. Sorry, can you hear me? I want to ask you some questions about the Catonsville 9 action. I was going to ask her some questions. Yeah.
I like the dialogue better. I would rather be home making dinner and serving soup than being up here, but...
Yeah, we've worked this out. So this action took place on May 17th. 9 people were arrested, right?
Yes.
And then they went to court and they were supposed to go to jail.
Right.
Is it my understanding that both Phil and Dan went underground?
Well, first of all, there was a trial, and the state trial, and then they were given a date, as often prisoners are, to turn themselves in. So we had a grand going away. I think so too. We had a grand, at Viva House, we had a grand going away party. Said goodbye, we'll see you, meet you at the courthouse in the morning. Well, we get to the courthouse and there's only John Hogan and Tom Lewis. All the others went underground. They wanted to up the ante, as they call it. So they stayed underground until the FBI found each one in different places. Mary Moylan was never found. There were 2 women part of this action. Margarita Melville, who's coming, we're picking her up Wednesday to be here for the great events this weekend of Catonsville 9, and Mary Moylan. And Mary was a nurse in Uganda, midwife, and she went underground. She spent some time with some of the Revolutionary Party people, and she was very much influenced by Erica Huggins and Bobby Seale when they were arrested, and they did their time, and Mary eventually gave herself up. It was a very difficult time. It's no secret that we had a lot of contact with her by another name and another look of her. Mary's original identity was beautiful red hair, but she would never stay with us because she was afraid of what would happen if people came in with guns, she wouldn't stay in a family with children. But anyway, so Mary decided she would. So I arranged with the lawyer, Harold Buckman, to turn herself in. And she eventually did, actually she only did about 9 months. She had, she got out, and we of course, were helping her get started. And she really wanted to go back to nursing. And the funny story about this is, I guess it doesn't matter, a hill of beans, but she had a terrible time getting her nursing license back. And we did this, we did that, and explained to the board, you know, that she's a felon and she convicted, all this kind of stuff. Anyway, came down to, she paid her nursing fee. At that time, it was $25. She paid her nursing fee and got her license just through the mail, so she practiced nursing. And Mary has died. 7 of the 9 have passed away, so there's only 2 living members of the Catonsville 9. What is important about this is that we heard this morning, and certainly Barbara Mikulski explained about voting. Well, some of us are a lot better at voting with our feet. And so we've tried all these 50 years to do a lot of street theater, protest, picketing, civil disobedience. Brendan and I have never done much time. I mean, 10 days is the most. We just do the little things. These 2, what they didn't tell, they make a great team. Yes, they did do housing services for the poor. However, one of their tactics was they would go down, you didn't mention this, they'd go down to the housing department and with the family. They would sit in the office until the family was given housing. So that was...
We actually started with 6 women. Is this on? Started with 6 women, and we sat in down at the housing department, and it was really funny because the secretary and receptionist was out front, and all the commissioner and his 2 assistants had their office doors behind her, and as soon as we show up, because we did this for several weeks, the commissioner and his 2 assistants would shut their doors and leave this poor receptionist out there by herself. And she would have to get up with a key whenever one of the children wanted to go to the bathroom. She'd get up and walk them to the bathroom and open the door for them. So the next time we went, we told them, the parents and grandparents, to make sure the kids drink a lot of Kool-Aid before they come down. And so they did. And so that poor woman, she was getting up every few minutes. We told them also to bring a boom box and bring some cards and just sit there. And yeah, until families got housed, we were going to sit in. And by the time we stopped doing that, there were about 40 or 50 people we were taking down. And there was one day, you might remember, Brendan, when it was snowing outside, and I think they probably figured they'll never come down today, but we came through the snow and we sat in and demanded housing for people. Power concedes nothing without a demand, Frederick Douglass said. It never did, and it never will.
I just want to say something about the Catonsville thing. I guess most people in here don't know anything about the draft. The draft was the way they got people into the military back. I'm 75, and when I left the seminary in New York, the rector of the cemetery, I shouldn't say cemetery, but I always slip on that. I left in February. He had me 1A by May the 1st. So I'm here in Baltimore. I have a 1A classification, which means 1A means you're prime candidate, all you do is go for your physical. So I knew then, the reason I left the seminary was Cardinal Spellman was in charge of the military ordinariate, which meant that he was for the war. He had friends in Vietnam. And I said, I'll be damned if I'm going to get ordained by this guy. So I left and came right down to Baltimore to work with Phil Berrigan. So here you go now. When you apply for conscientious objection, you've got to prove, you can't prove your conscience to anybody. You got to prove that you have a valid conscience, et cetera, et cetera. And because I was white and had facility with the language, I could talk about my conscience. A lot of people have the same conscience, and because they can't articulate it, they can't do the same thing. So the guy told me that there was 4 lawyers at the draft board in the Bronx, about 3 blocks from Yankee Stadium, and they said, the Catholic Church is not a peace church. Therefore, you can't be a pacifist. And I said, well, I am, and that's the way it is. So either I get 1-0 classification or I go to jail. Well, they must have thought it over, and they told me I could be a conscientious objector. I ended up working at Johns Hopkins here at the Phipps Clinic for 2 years. Imagine, I knew nothing about being a nurse or a nursing assistant in the psych ward, and I had just seen the movie, what's it called? One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And damn if they weren't doing, that kind of shock therapy. So anyway, those 2 years passed longly, and then, we worked full-time at the house. And one more thing on the Catonsville thing, when you have a draft record back then, that was the only copy. So if you screwed up that draft record, that person in Catonsville whose name was on it, unless they were out of their mind, re-registered. We know for a fact that some people did not re-register, okay? We know for another fact that since there were not duplicates, actions like that took place all over the country. Over 200 draft boards were raided, some very creatively. So it's why there is no draft. And then we went to this euphemism called the volunteer army of the unemployed, probably the unemployed. And since we don't see the killing anymore, you're not allowed to see it, we drone warfare people, and the nation doesn't know. You don't see the body bags coming back the way we used to see at Phil Berrigan's parish, at Peter Claver's church. The body bags will tell the Americans, hey, this is crazy. We've lost 58,000 people for nothing, for absolutely nothing. And we have been at war 222 years, and the country's only been here 242. Think about that. When you talk about unemployment, there's no money if you send it to the military. That's a no-end game.
Right. And incidentally, when I went down to register for the draft at 18, I applied for conscientious objector status too. I remember there was a form that you were supposed to fill out, although they really expected you to write a whole book, a treatise or something, like you were Thomas Aquinas or something. But anyway, until a friend of mine went down to register, and I went with him in October, because my birthday was in June, I didn't hear from the draft board, but then they told me that I had not written enough to prove sincerity. But while I was in college, and I was in college from 1970 to 74, while I was in college, there was this whole lottery system. Just like you see the Maryland State Lottery now where they pick the numbers. Well, they assigned a number to everybody's birthday. So my birthday was June 3rd, and that year June 3rd came up as, out of 365, it was number 57. So that was like expressway train to Vietnam. And I wasn't afraid to go to Vietnam. And in fact, my family had provided a number of people. I had 2 brothers that served in Vietnam at the same time, and maybe a 3rd brother. I'm not sure where he served. It's hard to get a straight answer out of him. And my sister was in the military for a while. So out of the 8 of us, about half of us had served in the military. I wasn't afraid, and I wasn't going to leave the country. I would have just, I guess, done the time if I had to.
Well, to bring it up to date now, over the past years, from the draft board actions came the plowshare actions. Plowshares, as Ralph said earlier, swords into plowshares. So the latest one on April 4th involved, I told you wrong, Ralph, there were 8 people.
Oh, 8 people, okay.
Yeah, anyway, they're Catholic workers. We're Catholic workers. Ralph is an adopted Catholic worker, and there are Catholic workers here in the audience, Lou and Mary and Linda up there. There they are. So we, of course, do the soup kitchen and all that kind of stuff, and there's about 200 houses around the country like ours. Nobody, we're the elders of the Catholic worker, nobody is going to do a big soup kitchen anymore. All the young ones have smaller houses and do smaller things like farming, or they'll take two families in, shelter 2 families, things like that. But the plowshares movement has been very important to the Catholic worker. My friend, I wish I could put my arm around her now, my friend Elizabeth McAllister is part of Jonah House here in Baltimore City. And we've been friends since she was a nun, came down for the Catonsville 9 trial, and then eventually married Philip Berrigan and has 3 children. The oldest child, Frida Berrigan, is a very interesting writer, and I just would like to read a little part of a piece she wrote. Frida, all the kids, they're all coming down this week for the Catonsville stuff. The title of her essay is, "How do you tell the kids that Grandma is in jail for resisting nuclear weapons?" "Our grandma is in jail," Madeline tells a woman wrestling a shopping cart at Target. "She went over a war fence and tried to make peace," Seamus adds hopefully. "They arrested her and she is in jail now." "Where?" the woman asked, looking from them to me in disbelief and maybe pity. "We don't remember," the kids said. Kids are 6 and 8. Suddenly done with their story and ready to make passionate pleas for the colorful items in the dollars section over the woman's shoulder. "Georgia," I say, but I don't have a lot of energy to add detail to my kids' story. They hit all the high points. "There's a lot going on these days," she says. I agree, and we move on into the store and our separate errands. I was happy not to say more at that moment, happy to avoid a sobbing breakdown at Target, happy to wrestle one little bit of normal out of a very abnormal day. And she goes on to talk about the plowshare action. They wanted to go to Kings Bay because of Martin Luther King. They talked in their press statement about the nuclear subs. There's 6 nuclear warhead subs at Kings Bay, and they would go out and take turns coming back. They have indetectable launch platforms for nuclear weapons. So nobody else, except in England, there's 2 of these nuclear submarines with warheads. So in the press statement, they talk about that. They talk about white supremacy and how important the issue of racism has to be discussed as far as in this country, especially considering the war. And Liz wrote recently, oh, you should see how they have to write. We have to send a postcard. You can only send a postcard. They're in a Georgia jail. The charges right now, the feds haven't put in charges, but right now they're up for 11 years in prison. They'll do substantial time. But we have to send a postcard with the stamp by the postcard, because if you put a postcard stamp on there, you might put a drug behind the stamp. Myself, I'd rather have a glass of beer than lick a postcard, you know, but that's what they say. And that's what they have to send out. So Liz said, we raise our voices in a cry to dismantle the weapons, all of them, and we risk life and limb and our future hopes to make this plea, dismantle the weapons. So they went in and they had vials, baby bottles with their own blood, and they would put it on the different buildings and graffiti and things like that, and then they were arrested. So there's no trial yet. They're just in a county jail. They have their own, you can go on Facebook, I think. We don't do Facebook, but you can go on, obviously you guys know a lot more than I do about going on Google to find. So that's about Liz, and I dearly, dearly miss her.
If anybody wanted to send a postcard to Liz, you have her name, Mick Allister, 1L, and the number, very important, 65198, and say, "We saw your spirit at Hopkins." That would probably be very helpful if anybody wanted to do it. Because you have to agree with Erica that being in jail is no piece of cake.
You might have gathered by now that we feel that war is not good for anybody's health while we're talking about health. We're still feeling the effects of prior wars, physical and emotional and social effects. We're fighting over Civil War monuments, for example, and a woman got killed in Virginia just a few months ago demonstrating against those monuments. There was Agent Orange during Vietnam, and even before Vietnam, when the bombs were dropped at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the radiation effects are still being felt by people in the world. And so Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Vietnam, what's going on in Iran and Afghanistan now, all of these things have had long-lasting impacts, not good impacts. So at this point in my life, I worry about the future for my children and especially the grandchildren. It just feels very uncertain, and it feels just plain insane that there are weapons in the world that could destroy the world many times over. And here we are at this moment in time trying to convince the Koreans and the Iranians to end their nuclear program. And I think, and I learned from the good nuns, that it's better to be an example and all than to tell people things. Most people would rather see a good sermon than hear one. We should get rid of our weapons. We should divest ourselves of all of that crap, and then we can talk to the Iranians and the Koreans about getting rid of their program. All right, I think we can.
One last thing, that it really is better to burn paper than to kill children.
Amen.
That's on this postcard, and I'll leave them out at the desk out there. And it gives the events for next weekend. Friday is at UMBC Shriver Center, and Saturday is the church right down the street from the draft board in Catonsville.
Are there any questions out there? I see there's questions here, but with my bad eyes, I can't quite make them out. Are there any questions out in the audience?
Can you see them, Bob, the questions? He
Yeah,
can't see them.
White on blue. I know, I can't see them.
Can you ask him, Bob? Oh,
I think Imani's going to come and read them to us or something. Okay. You know, us old people.
White on blue is not good.
Yeah, no, I know.
Want me to read it?
Yeah.
Okay. Much like Pope John the 23rd and Pope Francis preaches a gospel of the oppressed, what do you think he could be doing that could leverage the tremendous power for the Roman Catholic Church?
Anybody? What could the Pope be doing to unleash power?
Yes.
Well, it might not be related, but if I think the Pope could get it worked out that women could become priests,
Just what I
that
was
would
going to
say
say.
a whole lot.
Yes, yeah.
Right? That would make a great statement to the world, I think. Some of us participated this past Sunday, last Sunday, on Vocation Sunday. We held up banners and demonstrated outside the Basilica downtown, which is the oldest basilica and cathedral in the country. And we were calling for the ordination of women, because I think women would make a whole lot of difference in the church and in government and all that. They have a different perspective. They I don't want to seem chauvinistic, but I think they understand and care for children much more easily, and our testosterone works against us as men oftentimes. Oh.
There is another one, but if you wanted to answer.
No.
No?
Baltimoreans view themselves as deeply religious, and there are at least 250 churches in this city. What can the religious community be doing that would mobilize parishioners to greater social engagement?
Anybody?
One answer could be that old thing, don't just do something, stand there. Stand in front of the tanks. I don't mean that so much literally, but do what you can. Don't pay the taxes. Resist. Don't let your children go to war. Do what you can to resist. So don't just do something, stand there.
Right. And, you know, we're supposed to be talking about the church's role, and those are the kind of things that the church should be. This should be much more assertive. When Reverend Raphael Warnock was here the other day, he used to be here in Baltimore, now he's at Ebenezer Baptist Church. He talked about one day when all the churches had a program, an effort to help people get expungements. They did it on the same day. And so the churches can act collectively, and they can do things like that. They can meet the needs of people out there in the neighborhoods where their congregations are. Are we supposed to be stopping? Oh, okay.
Time is up.
Well, I think our time is up. And I want to thank Brendan and Willa and Brendan and Liz for being with us here today.
Is with two extraordinary people, both who were part of the Poor People's Campaign in 1968.
Thank you, Willa.
And Resurrection City. The photographs that are out in the hallway and the photographs that will be projected are the photographs of Mr. Robert Houston. Bob Houston is a resident of East Baltimore and was a legendary photographer whose work is in the Smithsonian, the African American Museum, and recently was the subject of a major photojournalistic piece on him in the Washington Post. Mark Steiner, I think, is well known to most everyone here. So let me turn it over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Bob. Welcome. Glad we're here. And it's always a pleasure to be with Rob Houston, who's one of my favorite folks. A wise, gentle, powerful human being, and a great photographer. Let me ask you a question. So, how many people here have heard the word Poor People's Campaign? Okay. How many people here know how it really started? All right, not many. So let me tell you a quick story, then we'll start this between us. And maybe we won't realize this, and I actually just learned some of this myself when I was interviewing the Edelmans, Peter Edelman and Marian Wright Edelman. Those names familiar to you? Marian Edelman runs the Children's Defense Fund. Peter Edelman is her husband, who is a law professor at Georgetown. And he worked for Robert F. Kennedy in the 60s as his aide when he was a senator. Marian Wright then was an activist lawyer in Mississippi in the South, fighting for the rights of folks and doing lots of work. And they met when Robert Kennedy took this tour through the South and through Appalachia and other places to see poverty firsthand, and that's how they met. That's also where the two of them fell in love, which is kind of cool. Won't talk about that today, though, another day. It's a great story. So, at any rate, Marian Wright and Peter Edelman were asked by Robert Kennedy to come to his house to talk about poverty in America, in Virginia. And during the course of the conversation, they had lunch, and then Robert Kennedy said, "You mind if I take a swim?" And they said, "No, it's your house. I mean, take a swim." And he took a swim and was doing his laps. And at one point, he stopped and put his hands on the edge of the pool and said, "What we need to do is bring thousands of poor people to Washington, D.C. to end poverty in America." Marian Wright said, "That is the idea." The next day, she happened to be meeting with Martin Luther King, which was in the very early fall. This is like September of '67. And she was meeting with Martin Luther King and said, "Martin," is what she called him, "Martin, this is what Bobby Kennedy said, Senator Kennedy said." And Martin Luther King said, "That's the idea. We're going to do this." And that was the birth of the Poor People's Campaign. And so it's an interesting synergy that took place between all these people and those two men who died within months of each other. Let me not say died, who were assassinated within months of each other, and what they represented. So both Robert and I'll tell this quick story and let Robert jump into how he got to Resurrection City, then we'll talk about what all that means and what that stood for and how it's relevant to 2018 where we are now, as you're looking at Robert Houston's work above us that he did at Resurrection City. So I worked at Resurrection City. I had gotten back from Cuba in early 1968 when it was really illegal to go to Cuba. And fell out with my brothers and sisters in an organization called the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. And we fell out because they had a different idea where we should go. They wanted to blow buildings up, some of them did. And I said, well, we have to organize among the people first and build a revolutionary army, then we can blow buildings up. So we had a little difference. And so I went to work with the Young Patriots and other groups that were organizing on the ground to build counter-institutions and fight against poverty in America. And the Young Patriots were the Appalachian white version of the Black Panther Party out of Chicago. And they formed a coalition with the Panthers and the Young Lords and the Brown Berets that Erica Huggins talked about earlier. And so I worked with them as we went to work and organize in poor white communities into the Poor People's Campaign. What Martin Luther King did in this campaign, the demands that were made, not just him, but everybody involved, the demands that were made were very powerful. The demands were $35 billion a year in 1968 dollars to end poverty in America. 500,000 new houses to be built every year in the United States, until every slum dwelling, as they were called then, were torn down and replaced with houses, not like what happens around here, where houses are replaced for people of means, but houses are torn down and replaced for people who are poor working class people to live in those houses. The demand was also for full employment, and if we couldn't have full employment, then a guaranteed income for every citizen of this country. Those were some of the leading demands of the Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign was made up of African Americans from all across America. From the South, it came in caravans from 6 different directions around the country: north, south, east, and west. So rural folks from the South who were black folks from urban areas, especially in the north, Mexican Americans from the west, Puerto Ricans from New York, Appalachian whites and poor whites from Chicago, Native Americans from reservations all across the west, especially the west and northwest, that made it to the Poor People's Campaign. Now we're going to talk a bit about Resurrection City, but it wasn't just Resurrection City. Resurrection City was a place where I lived in Resurrection City, Rob lived in Resurrection City, but it was mostly poor whites and black folks who lived in Resurrection City and Puerto Ricans who lived in Resurrection City. When the Mexican Americans got from the west to the east, it was Resurrection City was not ready for them. It was a shambles already. And they moved to a place called the Hawthorne School. We spent a lot of time with them, and they took a lot of direct action from the Hawthorne School. The Native Americans who came in ended up living at the Episcopal House for the most part. And what the original idea of the Poor People's Campaign was that thousands of poor people would come to D.C. and lock the city down, demonstrate, take over government buildings to demand the end of poverty in America. King was assassinated I really personally believe, and I was talking with Maria Varela, interviewed her the other day at the Smithsonian Institute, who was a Mexican-American woman from Chicago who worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the South, and then went to work in the Mexican-American community and was part of Resurrection City as well, and a photographer as well, and a really good photographer, self-taught. So she thinks, and I agree with her, that the folks who ran the Southern Christian Leadership Conference were just devastated, suffering from post-traumatic stress, couldn't get anything together because they had just seen Martin Luther King shot before their eyes, bleeding to death on a balcony in front of them. So it was a bit disorganized, but it was also powerful at the same time. And I was there at the very end when the police came in with the false accusations that people had thrown stones on passers-by, which did not happen. And they came in with their bulldozers and tear gas. And those who were left, the few of us who were left, they came running in. Most of us were arrested. I was not arrested because I happened to see this woman with her 2 little children in a panic. And I remember running over to her and putting these pieces of rags in the mud and sort of put them in front of your kid's face, put it in your face, give me one of your kids, you take the other, I'm gonna get you the hell out of here. And we did get out. And it was insane at the end. But people went back to their communities and organized and really embedded themselves in neighborhoods and created real work to end poverty in America and to fight and build a political organization. So I just want to encapsulate that moment. And 68 was a pivotal year, but it's not a year in isolation. Things build up to 1968, and they happened post-1968. You got to remember, it was also a period, I think Erica talked a bit about this, other people talked a bit about this. The government came after us. The government came out, and I mean come after us. I mean, like what happened to Fred Hampton was not an isolated incident. In Chicago, who knows who Fred Hampton is? He was head of the Black Panthers in Chicago. The police stormed into that house while he was in his bed and assassinated him. That happened over and over and over again. Erica, who spoke earlier, her husband was killed as part of the Los Angeles Panthers, murdered. So it was a very intense time we were in, and the war itself. I won't go into that story with me, but all of us got drafted at one point or another, and we had to respond in one way or the other. So I'll stop there for a moment, and let me turn to Rob Houston and talk a bit about how you ended up working for Life magazine, something you did not expect. The great Gordon Parks is the man who you could say, is Robert's mentor. And talk a bit about how you ended up in Resurrection City and what that story was.
I think it was 1960, the latter part of 1966, beginning of 67.
Can you all hear? Let me give you a handhold, Michael. You got it? You got it? Cool. All right, good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. All right.
It was 1960, the latter part of 1966, beginning of 67. Had always been a fan of National Geographic, Time, Newsweek, and Life, especially Life. I read an article written by Mr. Gordon Parks. He had done a story about a very destitute family who lived in South America. Mr. Parks was living with them, doing a story for Life. He became attracted to their youngest son. The boy was sick. The parents could not take care of him. Mr. Parks got permission. He brought him back to the States. The boy regained his health and got homesick, so he went home. At any rate, I was so touched by this story, I wrote Mr. Parks, telling him I wanted to be like him, only better. He was kind enough to send me a letter, very encouraging letter. At that time, I vowed I was going to do everything I could to one day shoot for Life magazine. Not having gone to school for photography, having received my first camera when I was 4 years old, I concentrated my effort in photography. At any rate, I went to New York a year later to the date that I received a letter from Mr. Parks. I went into Time Life magazine building. Security guards on both elevators. You gotta state where you're going and who you're going to see. I didn't know anyone. I came outside of the building and I said, I have got to scheme, I've got to find a way to get into this building on the 25th floor. That was the photographer's lounge. As fate would have it, well, at that time, the building faced the streets on two sides, floor-to-ceiling glass. As fate would have it, well, divine providence, a very attractive blonde was on the opposite side of the street, walking south. She had on the shortest micro skirt I've ever seen. The security guards and everybody in the lobby of the building went to one window. I saw my opportunity, I made a mad dash. I got on the elevator and I went up to the 25th floor. Mr. Parks wasn't there at that moment. But the secretary looked at me and she said, sir, who would you like to see? I said, I'd like to see Mr. Parks. She tells me he's not here yet. She said, but where are you from? Do you have an appointment? I said, no, I don't. She said, well, I will let you pass this time. She said, if you go into the lounge, have coffee, when Mr. Parks comes in, I will announce you. Short time later, Mr. Parks did come in. I walked over to him. He extended his hand. We clasped a very firm handshake. Mr. Parks said, what can I do for you? I only have a short while. I said, sir, I'd really like for you to look at my portfolio, time permitting. He said, sure. I had a box of 80 photographs, way too many. He took time, he went through every photograph. And as he was stacking them, he'd view them and stack them. I noticed one pile was growing much faster than the other. And I'm saying to myself, my God, am I that bad? All of a sudden, two other photographers that I really respected, Mr. George Silk and the old master himself, Alfred Eisenstadt. They came in and looked over Mr. Parks' shoulder, and I could hear them saying, he's good, he's good, he's good, he's good. At any rate, when they left, Mr. Parks grabbed the largest stack of my work and he handed it to me. And he said, these are good. You need to work on these. He said, Bob, I have one question to ask you. I said, sure. And I'm thinking to myself, the master is asking me a question? And he said, you don't really like people, do you? I said, I can take them or leave them. And he said, if you are going to stay in photography, you'd better learn to take them. Because trees and seascapes don't buy pictures. I promised him I would concentrate on shooting people. A year later, I was back in New York. I called the office at Life. He was on his way out to Paris. He took the time. He was gracious enough to take the time. And he said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "I just want you to know I got an assignment from Black Star. I'm going to New York. No, I'm going to Washington with a Poor People's Campaign. And I'm shooting for your magazine." He said, "Good. And you better do a damn good job, because everything you send in here, I'm looking at." I did. And after I had gotten the assignment from Black Star, which at the time was the largest picture agency in the world, I always had a thing about going to the top. It doesn't cost any more to travel first class. And at any rate, I had sent, at the same time, I had sent Black Star a portfolio and a letter requesting an assignment because I wanted to shoot the Poor People's Campaign. I hadn't heard from him because I beat the letter there. And when Mr. Chapnick, who was president of Black Star, asked me if he could help me, I said, "Yes, I want to go to Resurrection City." He said, "You know, there's a young man who lives in Worcester, Massachusetts. He sent me a letter saying that's what he wanted to do." "What makes you different?" I said, "Because I want to live on the inside. I want to live with the people." And he said, "But so does this young man from Worcester, Massachusetts." I said, "Sir, do you have a name for him?" He said, "Yes, Robert Houston." I said, "That's me." He said, "Oh, why didn't you say so?" So I had gone from literally obscurity to the biggest magazine in the world. He looked at me and he said, "When can you leave?" I said, "Well, I can leave." That was on a Monday. I said, "I can leave Friday." He said, "It doesn't start for 2 months yet. I need to know when you are going to be there so I will get the equipment you need." I said, I don't need anything but film." He gave me all of the film I could carry, and he said, "See you when you get back." And the rest, as they say, was history.
And that's the history you're looking at right here.
Yes, this was, for me, this was the major experience of my life, a life-changing experience. I had never met so many different yet similar people in my life. I had never witnessed such unity, caring. Several times I had to catch myself because I found out I was getting too involved with the subjects. And I think one of the things that started it, but we were somewhere near the Department of Justice in Washington, hundreds of people. There was one black guy standing on the corner, on the curb. He was not with the folk from Resurrection City. He was a resident of Washington. All this man did was raise a clenched fist, and he said, "Black is beautiful." The cops wrestled him to the ground, got him out of there quick. And I'm taking pictures of this, and I see 4 of Washington's finest approach me. I start to back up, and I hear people behind me saying, "Don't run. We got your back. Tell our story. And I said, you know, if these people who have nothing are willing to give everything, why can't I? I lost all fear from that point on. It didn't matter to me anymore. They were just fantastic people. I met, that's an example of folk who gave up stuff, gave up time to come and live there, to be there. And Dizzy Gillespie will always rank very high in my life. There were others there, were, you know, a Kodak moment. I'll get my picture, but I would never photograph them. I gravitated towards those who had not. I could identify with them. And they were not phony, they did not lie. I met a family out of Marks, Mississippi. I don't know if the lady's picture is there. She was called Miss Eve. Middle-aged woman at the time. But this woman had walked with a group of folks. She had walked from Marks, Mississippi to Washington, D.C. It took them 3 months. They slept in fields, schools, private homes, churches, wherever they could. She was determined, and they had nothing. There were families, again, out of Marks, Mississippi, which at the time was the poorest county in the United States. These folk were told by the founding fathers of Marks, Mississippi, go to Washington, but when you go, don't come back. The town gave them 12 buses. There were 2 cars, two state troopers, one at the beginning of the caravan and one at the end. As these people boarded the buses and started to drive out, they reported seeing men, women, and children running across the fields, chasing the buses, sticks, rifles, shotguns, and when they looked in the distance, they saw smoke. They had set their houses afire. They had nowhere to go but to Washington. And they came, Washington looked like Union Station. People coming and going all hours of the night. Some of them had no idea where they were going when Washington was over, when Resurrection City did not exist anymore. They had no idea where they were going. But they were absorbed. They were absorbed into the fabric of America. This is the power those folk had. They could tell you stories, make you cry. There was an instant where 3 young black males, I could guess they were early teens. They approached me, their newspapers. One of them handed me a newspaper and they said, "Sir, can you read?" I said, "What?" I said, "Sure, can you read?" He said, "No, we can't." They could not read. And then there were 2 white boys came towards me. I guess you'd call, at that time they were called a hippie type. And I sort of braced myself because I didn't really know what to expect. And I was shocked when both of them threw that fist in the air and said, "Good morning, brother." Wow, I'm learning everything every day. These are my folk. This is where I belong. But then you get this this guy. I won't tell you who he's deceased. Now that's the only reason why I won't tell you. I won't give you his name. He comes to Resurrection City in a stretch limousine. He is wearing a white suit, shirt. Everything about him is white. Gold, bling, all of this kind of stuff. And mud is up to our calves. He drives up. People open the door and stand back. And he sits in the doorway of the limo. And people say, what are you going to do now, dummy? You see all this mud, why would you come like that? And why did you come anyway? We don't need you. We're tired of people like you. Somebody went and got Reverend Abernathy. Abernathy got into the limo and they drove off into the sunset. And shortly after that, a group of folk went to the motel that Abernathy and his cronies were staying at. They never lived in Resurrection City.
No, I'll jump in real fast because I was part of that group. I was part of that group.
Okay. Okay.
And we were living in the mud in Resurrection City.
Yes.
I mean, it rained and rained. That was it.
Yes.
We were living in that mud. And then we got wind that the leadership was staying in this motel. And we're eating rice and beans. And so a bunch of us got together and a cross-racial group of black, white, Native American, Puerto Ricans who actually put on one of the best musical festivals we ever had inside the camp. It was great.
Yes.
But we went up to this motel and confronted Abernathy and the others.
Yes.
Who were sitting in a restaurant eating steak. And we were pissed.
Don't do as I do, do as I say do.
And demanded that they leave the hotel
Yes.
and live in the city with us.
Absolutely.
And I mean, it was a very kind of strange thing. You have one picture up here. You had a picture up here earlier of Robert Culp. There was a TV show back in the day called I Spy with Robert Culp and Bill Cosby. And so in our encampment, which was the poor white encampment, they used to come, people, all kinds of people like that would pass through. James Brown came through and hung out with us, and then Robert Culp, whose family was from West Virginia, came with Bill Cosby. And they came and sat down with us before all the other stuff happened with Bill Cosby, obviously, 50 years ago. And so they were just, that was part of what happened at that place too. And it was, I think, before we run out of time, we should take a couple questions here. And try if we can answer some things that people have asked us here. I think you answered one of them almost, Rob. The Poor People's March started in Mississippi Delta. I've heard it said that many who marched out of the Delta were told that they could never return and were taunted with racial epithets and threats. What was the experience of those who came to D.C. from the South at that time? So I think you answered that pretty adequately already with the story you told about the March, Mississippi. The March, Mississippi was also the place that, this is where both Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy had their minds blown about poverty in America. King had seen poverty. But don't forget, King was a middle-class guy. He came from a middle-class home and didn't experience poverty. What he saw in Mississippi blew him away, drove him to literal tears. When he met young people in Mississippi who had not eaten that day, little boys and girls had not had a decent meal in a week. Their lunch was an apple. That was it. And that was where one of the directions wasn't just south, it came from many directions, but came out of Marks, Mississippi. It was a mule train and others that came out of Marks, Mississippi, which is the place that they said. So what lessons does the Poor People's Campaign of the 60s have for the new Poor People's Campaign taking shape today? I'll start and I'll turn it over to Rob. Is that right?
Yeah.
So I really love this human being right here, by the way. What he does for us is amazing. Every time I have a chance to say, do this with Robert, I said, yes, of course, yes. I come to think of like my older brother.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
So it does relate to right now. You know that Reverend Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris are organizing the new Poor People's Campaign. And they plan to do all kinds of actions around the time of Resurrection City and the Poor People's Campaign in May. Tomorrow is May, isn't it? May, June,
Yeah.
right? I should know that my birthday is next month. But let me give you an example of what we have to be aware of. What would Martin Luther King and all those folks do today if they were still with us? What would they be thinking? If they walked through Baltimore City and saw communities with abandoned houses, communities surrounding places like Johns Hopkins, and demolitions taking place, what do you think they'd be doing? I think they would be leading the people to say, this can't happen here. You're not just moving people out, you can move people in to new homes. That's what they would be doing. You know, I have a lot of respect for the institution, all the stuff that Hopkins does. Incredible stuff in our community. But those things have to be recognized as well. You don't displace, gentrification should not mean the removal of poor people from their homes.
Exactly.
And what else would they be doing? One more piece since we're sitting here. Right now, the nurses at Johns Hopkins University, they're trying to organize a union. And Hopkins has hired the same firm that advised Donald Trump to break the union. Would Martin Luther King stand for that? No. Would any of the people that I lived with in the mud stand for that?
No.
No. So we have to learn that we have to stand up for people who are poor. We have to stand up with the poor. We have to stand up for working class people. And we have to stand up for what's right in this country, what we can rebuild in America. That's what that was about. The Poor People's Campaign was about building a new America. Martin Luther King said, maybe we should not be integrating into a burning house. It didn't mean he didn't believe in integration in a multiracial society. It meant we have to build a new house. That's what this was about, building a new house, a society where everybody prospers. Someone else earlier, one of the panels said there should be no poverty in America. There shouldn't be poverty in America. It's absurd that we have people living in that kind of poverty in this country. That's what this Poor People's Campaign means, and that's what it means for today's campaign. And so that's something we really do have to keep in mind, you know. And I was having lunch with Eddie Conway in whatever that room is, and we were talking about Jackson, Mississippi, and the new mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Senator Chokwe Lumumba, and how their hands are tied because all the things he wanted to do, the city's now in debt to the banks and can't build what they want to build in that city, and his back is against the wall. That shouldn't be happening in America. That new leadership that's coming up in our political world, maybe we'll change that. That's why I love this younger generation, which I think is giving me more hope than I've had in a long time. People in their teens, 20s, and 30s and what y'all are doing. People who are like less than half my age, a quarter of my age. Good Lord have mercy, I'm getting old.
Yes, we are.
But, you know, Robert, why don't you pick up from there, then we'll see if we can get one more question before we have the next panel.
Just recently, someone younger than I don't know if they were making trying to make something, a joke or what, but they said, Bob, are you going on the next Poor People's Campaign? Only on one condition. The new folk that would be on this new Poor People's Campaign would have to be every bit as sincere and as tough as these folk. These were the originals. And I've always been told a copy is never as good as the original.
But it's something new.
Something new.
Something new. Can we have time for one more question? Are we cool with it? Okay. All right. So, you all right? Let's see what we got here. For Rob, let's see. What, in your imagination perspective, is the picture or image that is yet to be captured with potential to tip the balances of power in favor of the disenfranchised? Just a lightweight question.
And guess what? He's going to get a lightweight answer. Run that by me again. I got to dissolve that one.
You ready? Here we go.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it one more time. For Bob, what in your imagination perspective is the picture or the image that is yet to be captured with the potential to tip the balance of power in favor of the disenfranchised?
How about picture this, if you will. First, let me start by saying this. Just before he died, Dick Gregory was on the West Coast. He was supposed to make a speech on the East Coast. He called ahead and he postponed that. He said there was no way he was going to be on the East Coast because he was going to spend at least one more day in California. And he said something was happening in California that he had to see for himself. That was the day it was reported that there were 2 sunsets. Now, when you see 3 sunsets, rays of light coming from the skies, that's when it's going to be a perfect day. Best answer I can give you. Because as long as man is in control, forget it. It ain't going to happen. You've got too many folk who only think of themselves. They are their only concern. When men and women can love each other as God intended, then you'll have semblance of peace. But man has to extend himself. Peace ain't free. So once you get rid of the dead weight, the dummies, then you got possibilities. Best answer I can give you.
So, thank you for letting us join you today. Appreciate it. It's time for the next panel. Is that right? Are we ready for the next one? Good.
Well, as we started the day on a high note, and as the day has progressed, to hear extraordinary stories, hear amazing, powerful poetry and photography, so too this panel is truly exceptional. And I could not be more pleased to welcome the entire panel, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Dominique Stevenson, to lead it off.
I'm not going to get into a lot of detail in terms of introductions of our panel. I'm hoping we'll have a really rich conversation. We have a little bit of time, and I want to devote most of that time to allowing these folks to speak about the work that they're doing as well as who they are. Okay, so we're going to jump right in. And we're going to start, and I have to say I'm really very excited also that there are 2 young women of African descent on this panel. That said, you know where I'm going to start. to my left. Destiny.
Hi, my name is, do I need a mic?
You do.
Okay. Hi, my name is Destiny Watford. I live in a small neighborhood called Curtis Bay, where we fought to stop the nation's largest trash burning incinerator from being built in our community. Yeah. And we used that momentum, that fight, for another fight for community control of land in our neighborhood. That's what I'm going to be talking to you guys about today.
Well, I really don't know, Bishop Douglas Miles, I really don't know what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm just going to follow the flow of the conversation and jump in wherever it seems feasible to jump in. We're living in very perilous times, and it's important that we understand the context out of which we're seeking to organize and to do activism. And if we don't fully understand that context, I think that 20 years from now we'll look back and regret not taking some steps that we should take.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is DeRay Smith. I am an organizer. I've stood behind many causes, but right now my thing is Tubman House, and I'll talk more about that later.
I'm Eddie Conway, and I have been engaged in organizing since '67. So, and I'm also part of Tubman House, but I'm also part of The Real News. So we'll talk more about that. Yes, we do. I don't know.
Okay, they made that really quick. And then we're going to be entertaining questions from the audience, but I'm going to just kind of get it kicked off. One of the things that I wanted to ask you all, first of all, I don't think we can talk about 2018 in Baltimore without talking about 2015 in Baltimore, in the Baltimore uprising. And 1968, 2015, whatever, it seems as if there's always a rush to quell the outrage behind these uprisings. But in the end game, it seems like there's not enough being done to address the conditions that create that outrage. So I'd like you all to comment on, for those of you who were around in 1968, but also 2015, and the uprisings here in Baltimore.
It's the same dynamic at work in '68 as happened in 2015, in the attempt to quell things and to quiet things. That's the atmosphere that business has to have in which to operate. It has to have a stable environment. It cannot stand disruption. And '68 and '15 both disrupted business as usual, at least in the city of Baltimore. That's one of the things that needs to be understood as we look at America 2018 and America in 1968. Both troubled times where the attempt was and continues to be to keep below the surface the real problems that this country faces. And the problems aren't just centered around race, it's centered around class, it's centered around gender, it's centered around sexuality. And until this nation grows up, you know, America, if you look historically, is about 20 years old historically. Until it fully grows up, we cannot fully address the problems that we're facing.
Thank you.
And I guess I want to add to that. I was here in the city in '68. I had just came back from Germany from 3 years in the Army and decided to come home and see what the problem was. There was riots raging across the nation. And I know they had just passed the Civil Rights Bill while I was away. They had implemented something called the War on Poverty. And yet, when I got back in various communities, white and black, there was massive poverty, and that was the foundation in which eventually led to the riots, not just in Baltimore. I mean, the assassination of Dr. King triggered it, but the massive poverty across the nation is the reason that it existed and was able to be triggered by a particular incident. And so one of the things that we were doing when we got home was we was trying to figure out, and this is ex-soldiers and so on, why this poverty existed when the segregation was outlawed, or the Civil Rights Bill was passed, a war was on poverty, and yet, and people were employed. There was employment in the communities, but the pay was so low that people couldn't afford to eat. They couldn't afford to send their children to the school. Children were going to school hungry in the morning. They couldn't afford to move into these neighborhoods that were open up and available to relocate in because people were working for $3 and $4 minimum wage. And it was not enough for them to survive on. So one of the things we tried to do is we tried to integrate white-collar jobs, and I participated in the integration of the Sparrows Point Fire Department. And not only was the racism there, because it was like 6 of us blacks went in there, and it was 100 white firemen there, not only was the racism there, but also the need to hide us. They put us in the shipyard. They put us in places where we couldn't be seen. And so in large part, it wasn't a lack of jobs, but it was a lack of money, a lack of finance, and a lack of acceptability. In 2015, and I was here again, and I'm sure the young people can speak on this more than anything else, but the unemployment, the massive poverty, and so on was 10 times worse than it was in '68. In fact, it looked like the city had been hit by a war when I look back at '68 and look forward to '15.
Well, I mean, I obviously wasn't around in '68, and neither were my parents. And actually in 2015, around the uprising, I was in the military, and I was getting out shortly. And I was actually inspired by Eddie's story and his actions. You know, I watched as things sort of unfolded in front of me with, you know, my shipmates on CNN, and hearing their reactions to some things. It was just like, yeah, these are not my people. They don't quite get it. I need to go home, and I need to be with my people. So, you know, that really inspired me to come home and to, you know, do a lot of the work that I was doing. But like I said, around 2015, I was just a spectator.
I also was not around in 1968. However, I was in Baltimore during the uprising, and I am, first of all, honored to hear like what your experiences was in 1968 and hearing the relevance of it during the uprising and that connection, because like though like we were fighting, we meaning my community and I were fighting the incinerator at the time of the uprising that this travesty took place, like this was such an eye-opener of how, like, just how much the issues across the city are all connected to each other. Like in South Baltimore, we were fighting against an environmental injustice, and a young man was shot. Police brutality was happening right before us in our city, and the response from our mayor, from our elected leadership was to call them thugs, to call people thugs, to say that this poor young man was like a criminal and a bad person. And we heard similar stories or similar things said about us, of us being like liars and not, like we don't know anything about what we're doing. We're just trying to spread lies about this horrible development that would be killing us in our community. And so what 2015 showed me was just how deeply the webs of our injustices across the city, which are usually like hidden by this like veil, this invisible veil that hides the injustice that we face all over was lifted in my eyes. And I begun to see like ways in which to organize and to think critically about how we connect to the injustices that we're all facing together, and doing it in a way that's really powerful and drastically changes the way that we think about how are people getting employment, how are we having actual stake and control over our communities, how can we prevent something like this from happening again.
There are at least three major differences between 2018 and 1968. One, there's a dearth of leadership in our country today on the national, state, and federal levels. There's just the absence of statespeople who look beyond partisanship and will address issues that need to be addressed. As segregated as America still was in 1968, there were at least leaders who were able to rise above party distinctions and to stand for the national good. Secondly, the quality and level of education in this country has deteriorated over the past 50 years. Public education used to be the way out of poverty for persons who were trapped in poverty. But now a high school diploma has become a passport to failure. So there's a lack of credible education. Third, the mediating institutions in this country have been completely eroded. In 1968, there was a strong African-American church that played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement and in just about every movement of any substance in this country. The black church is in trouble today because it has gotten lost in health, wealth, and prosperity gospel. A level of leaders have arisen in the African, and I'm a loving critic of the black church. I'm a product of the black church. I participate in the black church, and I still claim the black church as the primary institution of our community, but it's in trouble because there's a lack of connectedness to the communities where the churches are located, because for the first time in the history of this nation, the black church has become a commuter church, where people drive into church and then drive back to their neighborhoods. The other thing that's lacking in this country that's different from 1968 is the fact that there no longer is the connectedness between education and employment. In 1968, a man with not very many women were working at Bethlehem Steel at that time, but a man with less than a high school education could go to Bethlehem Steel and work, support his family, move them out of poverty. That's not possible today because of the disconnect between people's willingness to work and the ability to get jobs that they're qualified for. There are a whole lot of jobs available in metropolitan Baltimore, but our school system has not prepared people for that employment.
And I just want to add one thing, because the question was, you know, after every one of these particular uprisings or incidents, there's a lot of people come out, they pacify the population, things go back to normal, decades pass, there's another explosion. What's the problem? I would challenge John Hopkins and other major players in this city to make employment available to young black men and women. They need to do that. They have the finance to do it. If they don't want to continue to see these explosions, if they don't want to see the houses collapse, then and in fact, I mentioned this, Dr. Blum had me here in 2014 when I got out of prison, and one of the things that I said is you can put a program in place, deconstruction of these houses, that you don't need a lot of education for. You can train on-the-job training. You can employ a lot of the young people that's forced to stand on those corners. It doesn't have to happen there's the possibility of changing that now so that this won't impact another generation, because several generations already has been lost as a result of that unemployment, and several generations are in the prison system as a result of that. So if you want to change it, you need to put in place a work program similar to what they had in the 30s, and employ people. And then you won't have to, one, you don't have to live in fear. That's one thing. Two, you don't have to worry about families and children being broken and going hungry. So I challenge Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, the people, the institutions that's making money in this city need to put some of that money back in the city to change the conditions of the people in the city.
Okay, we actually have a question. Before I break to that question, I just have one more question that I kind of want to bring you all and what you do in your day-to-day lives into this discussion. So, and you've kind of segued into that to some degree, Eddie, in talking about the creation of employment and jobs. And in particular, I want to know from Destiny and DeRay, as young people, what are the tangible things that need to happen here in Baltimore, and who's responsible for making those things happen?
There's like a million answers to that. But I can tell you that I'm in my mid-20s, and I've been through countless number of, I guess, work programs or, work training. And what they sort of do is prepare you to do this little thing for this short period of time, and then you leave with nothing. So, maybe programs that are committed to like a lasting, I guess, something with some substance. There's a million programs and a million organizations, and they just sort of, they do their little thing and then they leave. And, for the most part, that's what a lot of us young people have out there as options. And it's not fair. It's really not fair. And it's hard to really say who's responsible, but I would say the people with money. The people with money, I feel like, should be responsible for creating those long-lasting programs. Because I don't have any money, I can't do it. But yeah, I guess large institutions, the people that are profiting off of us should be the ones that invest in us. But I also, I don't just expect that to happen. Look at history and look at what we have now. I don't expect that to happen. So a lot of it has to come from us, and we have to create our own institutions and our own systems, because clearly waiting around is not going to work.
Yeah.
To piggyback the last thing of what you said, like us needing to make our own institutions, I feel like that's a really big part of the question, or the answer to the question. Because when we look at, Eddie, you were saying earlier that some communities in Baltimore look like actual war zones. Like if you go down the block, that's what I see. That's what you see in Curtis Bay and East Baltimore and West Baltimore. And so I feel like one really big piece that's missing from, or a reason of why our communities are the way that they are, is that right now the community's voice is not being heard, right? So when development takes place, when choices are being made behind closed doors, people like me, people like you, people on this panel, people in communities who are facing these struggles aren't in those rooms. They're making the decisions. And the only way we're going to change that, I think, and a big part of what we're trying to do in Baltimore right now, is by pitting decision-making power in the hands of those people.
Thank you.
And I don't want to dominate, but as a black preacher, I will if you let me. So, but it's employment, employment, employment. And I think one of the things that's happening in Baltimore, or not happening in Baltimore, is that there's a disconnect again between things that are happening in the city and what people are being made aware of. Yeah. And I go back to the difference between 2018 and 1968. In 1968, there were approximately 200,000 Americans incarcerated. In 2018, there are 2.3 million Americans incarcerated, the largest percentage being African American and other brown people. So people start out in life in many instances with a strike against them and an opportunity to find employment. I agree with you. There are too many training programs that produce nothing but training. But there is one very strong and viable program going on here in Baltimore right now that I'm a part of called Turnaround Tuesday. And that program is putting persons with, who are ex-offenders to work in eds and meds. They're partnered with Johns Hopkins, with the University of Maryland, to provide career opportunities for persons to lift themselves out of poverty. And again, persons, you know, I have to own up to it. I'm a Hopkins graduate, but I'm a loving critic of my own institution. But this is one instance in which Hopkins has stepped up to the plate. It's the largest employer of ex-offenders in the state, and that needs to be acknowledged. And along with that, it has, again, partnered to create probably the largest and best training program to connect ex-offenders with employment opportunities in this city called Turnaround Tuesday that operates out of Zion Baptist Church on the east side and Macedonia Baptist Church on the west side. It's a production of the organization called BUILD, Baltimoreans United in Leadership Development, that's primarily church-based. So when folk stand up and say the church isn't doing anything, they need to really look around the city and see what the BUILD organization has done and is doing.
If you don't mind, I'm going to move on. We do have a few questions coming in, and you'll be able to approach the question again. Okay, so one of the questions is, how can students and others who come to Baltimore for school work with local organizations to help bring about change? How can students who come to Baltimore for school work with local organizations to bring about change?
I mean, it sounds as simple as that, like find an organization and get involved, but not just that. You know, you have to realize that you're coming into people's communities and you need to treat people's communities as if they're their communities. It's not your home. You know, you need to really find out what people are in need of, because it seems that a lot of people, you know, from out of town come to certain communities and they're like, oh, they need this, they need that. Well, did you ask? You know, you don't just go into someone's home and give them what you think they need. You need to build relationships. I guess first and foremost, build relationships with community organizations and people in the community, or else you don't belong there.
Okay.
I agree with that completely.
And all of us have to develop the habit of being better listeners. We don't listen to each other. We don't take the time to hear what people have to say as their own story about why they're where they are and who they are. And when we start listening to one another, we can start rebuilding community.
Next question. What does it take for a young person to become a good activist? This isn't my question. This is a question that someone has posed, so.
I think my last answer to that last question, that of course, you know, become a part of the community, but also study the history of movements, understand what worked, what didn't work before you just jump into it. I think a huge responsibility is on us to study movements of the past. Like I said, understand things that worked, understand things that didn't work. You know, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but a foundation has been laid down for us. You know, it's not like you're the first person that wanted to be young and an activist. The foundation has been laid down. Study that before anything else.
I'd agree with that. I'd also say, man, you like, it's like everything I think you're saying. Yeah, maybe. No, it's cool. I agree when it comes to activism, reflection, and deep research and understanding of the problem itself, like literally just getting into the weeds and understanding it is critical. And the other thing is building relationships, which was mentioned already. But I cannot stress enough the importance of that, because like doing this work, one of the biggest thing, the most beautiful thing that has come out of it, like, yeah, we stopped an incinerator and that was incredible. And yeah, we're fighting for a community-driven development, but the reason we're able to do that is because we are talking to our neighbors and we are seeing that, like, hey, Miss Betty who lives across the street has like lung cancer and is breathing in the same toxic air that I am. Mr. Donald who lives on 10th Street has flooding basements and a caving-in roof and is still paying $12,000 a month in rent. And the only way that we're gonna be able to change that is if we talk to each other about the issues that we're facing.
I'd like to add something to that, because I work with a lot of young people and have worked with a lot of young people over the years. Nothing changes in societies throughout history without young people engaging. I mean, it's always been the young people. Even when the Black Panther Party started, it was young people, junior high school children, young college students, etc. Young people are the engines of change because they're the ones that's going to inherit the future. And if young people don't engage, then they're going to end up in predicaments where they won't have any control. So young people have to kind of like step up to the plate, find out what they can do, find out how they can get involved, and then study. And study what other people have done and learn from that, learn from their successes, learn from their mistakes, and then tailor whatever it is that they want to do to the conditions that they find themselves in. But it's absolutely important that young people engage on some level if you ever want to see a better future.
I'm not big on activism. I believe in organizing. And organizing's aim is to create power, the power to create change. Activism is more like a herky-jerky motion that makes you feel good for a while, but nothing changes until you spend time organizing, until you spend time building a power base where you can impact the other powers that you have to interplay with, then nothing really changes. Organize, organize, organize.
I just want to say that as an activist, I organize. That's all.
Thank you. Okay. Next question.
I haven't seen too many activists organize.
How do you all interface? How do you all interface or work with universities or college students, if at all?
Okay. So what was it? It was college students and
universities. Like Morgan.
Yeah.
Hopkins.
So right now, I had the opportunity to go to Towson for school, Towson University, and this was I was going to school while I was fighting for the neighborhood while we were fighting together, and I was able to build relationships with professors and other folks at Towson and plug them into the work that we were doing in the community. And out of that process, a lot of really great things happened, like they became a part of our campaign. We're having a dedicated class in a Baltimore public city school system, nonetheless, dedicated to organizing, dedicated to like understanding the issues that we're facing in our community, and getting college credits for it, which was huge. And yeah, engaging with Towson students in that way and understanding the dynamics in our community and getting in basically where they can fit in, where they can contribute their skills to our effort.
I know Tubman House specifically, a lot of our volunteers are college students, Goucher, Towson, and a lot of them are like sociology majors, anthropology majors. And you know, when they come to to volunteer, it's like, yeah, that's great, but let's dig in this dirt. But they do gain a great wealth of knowledge, just coming from other places and actually to get to come into communities. So not only do we get to benefit from their very specific skills, grant writing, or they're very articulate and can help us a lot, but really they learn a lot. They can actually say, I came to Baltimore, and it's like I was actually in Baltimore. So I mean, we do engage with a lot of college students, and I think that they leave us with a good understanding of the real Baltimore. They can take it home with them.
Go ahead.
First of all, speaking for my generation, the baby boomers, we need to apologize to Generation X and to the millennials. And I say this from this standpoint, that we did not do a good job of passing along the story that you all need to have as a foundation upon which to build. No, organizing is not new, and the struggle is not new. But there's a gap missing between the baby boomer generation and the millennials as to what has taken place, who was important, who did participate in the struggle, and what the struggle has been about. So when young people organize today, they tend to organize from a disadvantage of not knowing the history of this city, of this state, of this nation, and what is going on. So I apologize on behalf of all baby boomers everywhere that we didn't do a good job of passing along the story. That said, I try as often as I can to interact with younger people. They're colleagues. I don't look upon them as students. They're colleagues in the struggle. It's my privilege to be one of the core instructors for the Bunton Neighborhood Leadership Program. The BUILD organization has organized voter registration drives at Coppin, at Hopkins, at Morgan State. So as often as I can be with those of another generation, I love it because it provides me the energy I need to keep going from day to day.
Okay, and I guess I'm one of those baby boomers, but I don't offer an apology to anyone because I spent 44 years in prison, and the leadership that existed from 60s to the early 70s that were radical, that were organizing, that was trying to make significant changes, was pretty much wiped out, pretty much locked up, killed, ran out the country, etc. And it's important to understand that we didn't drop the ball, we got hit in the head with a sledgehammer. And that's why drugs came into the community and poverty programs sprung up, and it brought off whoever could be brought off. Those things happen, and that's why the new generations don't have that information. That's why they're looking for that information now. We didn't control the narrative then. We're going to have to try to control the narrative now. We're sharing that information with people now. But that's what happened. It wasn't a disconnect, it was a disruption. And we need to recognize that. But in terms of young people, how do we interact with young people? College students, etc., you have to have a vision. And around that vision, you have to build an institution. And around that institution, college students will come and help you. If they can see it and they understand it and they can participate in it, they're not only activists, but as Bishop Miles have said, but they're organizing also because they can see the future. In our particular case, in Tubman House, we look at Gilmore Homes and the Sandtown, Winchester area, and we realize it's a food desert. We realize that there's no fresh food there. And we realize that there's a lot of land there because houses have been knocked down, and there's a lot of young people there that don't have a future in terms of employment because of the education system and so on. So we moved in there, and we're building an urban farm, and we're training young people to how to raise food. We're producing food. And just yesterday I witnessed bags and bags and bags of fresh food going into the community, free, that young people have helped plant that college students have helped come to teach and train them and cultivate. So you got to have a vision, you got to have an institution, and then you got to have support also. So activism and organizing, theory and practice.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to another question. We have a few more here. I don't know that we're going to get to all of these. And I'm going to read this question very carefully. It's in regards to the Turner Commission. So there hasn't been much mention of the Turner Commission report, which addresses the riots before Dr. King's murder. It outlines many of the solutions to what we've heard discussed today. What is preventing the application of these recommendations? And I'm not going to assume that everybody knows what those recommendations are, but I'm just posing the question as it was written. We can move on if you don't.
You want to tackle this?
I think many of the recommendations from the Turner Commission were valid then, and they are valid today. The need to invest in education, the need to invest in affordable housing, the need to, it just really addresses what was wrong in America in 1968 and what's wrong in America in 2018. The problem with reports is that they stay on the shelf. They're never enacted. And again, unless you have the power to force the report off the shelf and into action, it's of little use. There were several reports. I have a problem with a guy named Moynihan in the report that he wrote. He described an African American community I did not know. He said the African American community was in total disarray, and it was not. African American homes were headed largely by fathers. The family was basically intact, and what drove apart families in the African American community was the disruption of employment opportunities. When Bethlehem still goes from 33,000 jobs available to 3,000 jobs available, that disrupts people's ability to take care of their families. So I have some problems with some of the reports that have come out of the 1960s.
Okay, and I'll just add that the Turner report and the 50-year later revision of the report is problematic because it blames the victim. It put the problem in the black community, the black family, and black mores, when in reality, the problem was economics, it was capitalism, it was exploitation, and it goes all the way back to slavery, and it came all the way up to 68, and none of those people, families, generations were made whole. And there's no way in the world you can tell people they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they are still being exploited today. Today. And there's a problem with capitalism, and the Turner report never addressed that at all. It blamed the victims. And that's still the problem today. It's blaming the victims. Why can't they get it together? Okay, I'm...
And for all of those who believe in pulling oneself up by the bootstraps, I want you to sit where you are right now, bend down and touch your shoes and try to pull yourself out of your seat by your shoes. It's impossible.
Okay, our next question is, what do job training programs need to do and/or improve to be effective in Baltimore City?
Connect people to jobs. You can have the best training in the world, but if at the end of the training, as this young lady has said, there's no employment, what's the use of training? The training needs to be attached to real jobs in the real world, where people can make a living wage, take care of their families, and then have an opportunity to advance in this culture.
Yeah, and I'd also say support after the training. Continue to have a relationship with these people, continue to connect with these people, because a lot of the problem is not necessarily I just need a job. I'm hungry. There's just a lot that goes along with it. So I suppose after the programs are over, continue to be with these people. You say you're for and about these people. You don't just leave them when it's over.
Wraparound services.
Exactly.
And that's what Turnaround Tuesday offers. It worked for people for 2 years after their employment to make sure that they stay stable in their employment. It has an 84% retention rate. Every church in Baltimore, every religious institution in Baltimore ought to be teaming up to offer Turnaround Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, till Baltimore is put to work.
Either one of you want to address that? If not, I'll move on. Okay, we have approximately like 15 more minutes left. There was a question that's actually posed to Tubman House, but I kind of want to open it up to all the panelists. The question is, can you talk about what you do at Tubman House or what Tubman House does? Bishop Miles has talked about Turnaround Tuesday, so I want to start on another end. I want to start with Tubman House, but I also want Destiny. I want you all to talk about what you do for the last 15 minutes, and we'll wrap it up that way.
At Tubman House, we do everything. Tubman House, I would say, is an incubator. It's a place where you can learn. It's a community within a community. Tubman House is an urban farm. Tubman House is just a safe place for people to, I guess, have a sense of normalcy. There's so many things that Tubman House does, but a very large portion of what we do is urban farming. Tubman House is a model that can be followed. There could be 1 million Tubman Houses, and that's truly the goal. Tubman House is a place where we are showing people what can happen when you work together, and that's, intergenerationally. That's, we're working with college students, we're working with people that, have not been to college, old, young, everybody, and it really, to me, I would say, is an example of what self-empowerment is. We're just people with different skills. We brought them together, and, that's for the benefit of the community. So I would say Tubman House is a model of self-empowerment and just the start of creating those systems that are desperately lacking. We're working with everybody.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm with United Workers, which is a nonprofit in Baltimore. And I work on specifically Curtis Bay, where we're working to build a community land trust to have community-driven development, because the history in my neighborhood and in neighborhoods across the city has been what I was talking about earlier, the decisions of the land not being made by the people being affected by the issues that the decisions made cause in our communities. And so we are trying to build affordable housing for people that live in the community. Yeah, because the smell of gentrification is in the air with Under Armour and Sagamore. Yeah, and so we know it's coming our way, and we want to prevent our community, our neighbors, and the people that we've been organizing getting pushed out of the community that they love and that they want to be a part of, and that we're fighting so hard to change, by making housing that is affordable, that is sustainable, that offers wraparound services. Like, how do I deal with debt, which is a very real issue that people who live in poverty, people even like me, are living and struggling with debt. How do I do this in a way? How did I live in a way that is sustainable, that I can sustain my family? And so that's something that we're working on, and building this community land trust, having community-driven development in our neighborhoods is a part of a much larger citywide process, where people from all over East and West and South Baltimore are recognizing that, the only way we're going to change our communities is if we make these decisions, is if we make decisions about the land in our neighborhood. Because no one, not the people hiding behind closed doors, not people here at John Hopkins, if I'm being perfectly honest, knows what's best for our community. We do.
Thank you.
Well, I'm part of Tubman House too, so I guess all I could add to what DeRay said is that Deep behind the Tubman House concept is that of building a sense of a human family, a community that's larger than Sandtown, Winchester. We bring people in from all over the city and sometimes from outside of the city that work together in the center of the city. And we are developing a sense of family, of people across all races, all genders, etc., all ages. And it's something that's in the center of a community that has not been exposed to that kind of interaction, because the interaction around Soundtown has always been either police coming in, inspectors invading, or somebody coming to displace a family or disrupt a life. And so to be able to see people coming from far and wide around the city to the center of their community and work and interact with young people as well as them sets another example. It sets an example that there's a human family, and that the human family is part of a larger community. And so in the back of Tubman House is that concept, and it's that concept that people walking up and down the street can see every day and recognize as something that's beyond what the fears that we have and what we read or don't read about each other.
I'm clergy co-chair of the BUILD organization. BUILD next year we'll be celebrating its 40th anniversary as an institution in this city. And it's just what it says. It's Baltimoreans United in Leadership Development. Our major objective is to develop leaders on the local level who will then look at the issues that are of concern to them and gain the power to make them real in this city. The BUILD organization passed the first living wage legislation in this nation. The BUILD organization instituted and within this city the push for out-of-school time programming for young people, and organized the largest after-school initiative in this city called the Child First Authority. The BUILD organization is currently rebuilding the Oliver community, building affordable homes that young families can come back into neighborhoods that they were displaced out of on the east side, contiguous to EBDI. The BUILD organization built all of the new housing in Sandtown. And with a failure came because the city and the state did not fulfill its promise to rebuild around the transit stop over in Sandtown. We passed the first gun legislation in this state around Saturday Night Specials when William Donald Schaefer was governor. We have created the Turnaround Tuesday program, but the prime objective is always, and let me just say a word about Sagamore and Under Armour, because some criticism has been leveled at us for our participation in that. When the BUILD organization got involved in that initiative, the city council was getting ready, was on the verge of passing an MOU with Sagamore that only guaranteed one thing: 500 summer jobs for young people. The city council was getting ready to give away $680 million for 500 summer jobs for youth. Because of the BUILD organization's interaction, we got a $25 million fund for a job training center. We got guarantees of minority participation in every phase of construction. We got commitment of a guaranteed employment of a certain percentage of Baltimore City residents at every phase of the development there, and we even got some affordable housing out of it when before there was nothing being gotten out of it for the city of Baltimore. That's the kind of thing you can do when you organize for power, and you get the power to get at the table, to make a commitment and keep a commitment.
Okay, I want to just pretty much ask all of you as we wrap up to make a final statement.
You can go first. You go first.
Okay, well, my statement is just simple. What I always advocate is everybody here and everybody that can hear my voice, get involved, engage in something, find out what you can do, spend a little bit of your time helping to do that, to change things, and join an organization, build an organization, or just find a couple people to work with. But get involved. Just be active and organize.
I'll say if you are quote unquote organizing and your heart is not in it, you are in my way. You're in his way, her way, and her way, his way. So yeah, if you could just get out of the way, that would be great. And I'll also say, because I'm sure it was somebody in here that's asking about how to get organized, you can go on Facebook, go to Coalition of Friends /Tubman House, and send me a message, and you'll be there next Sunday.
Thank you.
The preacher in me must come out now. God has not called us to be the best, to be the brightest, to be the strongest. He just challenges us to show up ready and available. So show up as Noah did to build the ark. Show up as Moses did to lead the people of Israel out of bondage in Egypt land. Show up as Muhammad did. Show up as Peter and Paul did. And if you show up, God will show off.
And you have the last word.
I guess I'll just end by saying that if there's anything that I've learned organizing all these years, it's that organizing true change only really happens by changing hearts and minds. And so if we want to fight for a better Baltimore, for stronger communities, for a better life to lead, then we have to start by changing our thoughts and our city's thoughts about what can and what cannot happen.
Right. Thank you. And with that, we're done.
Would like to just make a few final comments. And I would first like to acknowledge 3 people who have worked tirelessly for the past month or more to make this symposium happen. So I would ask Amy Gawad, Amani West, and Natalie Wiggins to stand, please, so we can recognize. I will take just a couple of minutes to reflect on what I come away with for today. And it was indeed a really extraordinary day. 1968 was a tumultuous, painful, and transformative year. The same is true for 2018. And we will either learn from the past or we will repeat it. In 1968, as Eddie Conway so clearly said, it was a year led by youth, Black Panthers, Students for a Democratic Society, high school and college students who sat in at lunch counters and were brutally beaten and came back, people who marched, led by young people. Youth led the movement. Today, we see some very significant changes. We see women of courage standing up and speaking out in ways that haven't happened before. We see women signing up to run for elected office. As Senator Mikulski said when she started, there were almost no women. And that's changing, and that will continue to change. We see high school students in Florida the gun capital of America, reverse decades-old gun policy. So what do we learn from today? What I learned is radicalism comes in all colors, in all ages, and in all social situations. And we have seen that across the spectrum today. I come away seeing that engagement is all our business. It cannot be left to someone else. Building coalitions is the most likely strategy to success. And I think that is also one of the lessons of the past. I come away thinking that if you are locked out of the halls of power, then demonstrate in front of the doors that lock you out. I come away thinking that people my age have a primary obligation to support the generations behind us, to share what we have learned through failure and through some success. So what's our next steps? That's up to you. I can tell you one thing that we at the Urban Health Institute have been working to do, and that is we have been supporting a group of extraordinary high school students from across Baltimore who themselves have organized and are planning a youth symposium to follow on to today. That'll be held May 24th. And some have been here for the day. So congratulations on your work leading us forward. Our obligations as individuals and institutions, as you so well said, is to lead, follow, or get out of the way. I don't think we have a choice. I think we have to be part of the social change that is in front of us. Thank you very much for coming and being part of this colloquium.